What's cooking, folks? Vermillion Phoenix here, and today I'm here to talk to you about parts in general. Now, I have at least one of every part in the game. I probably have multiple of quite a few of them, but unfortunately, the part screen is one of the worst to talk about parts from, and that's because everything's sort of scattered. There was an audio pop. I hope this doesn't ruin the sound. If it does, I'll be re-recording this for you guys. Either way, yeah, as you can see, everything's kind of all over the place. There's no way to sort this or look at this well. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna head over to traps. And the trap screen doesn't have any particular filtering or organization that works well either, but on the traps themselves, you get these handy dandy pop-outs. So one of the things that I want to mention, or at least talk in depth about, is resonators and how they work for the game. And resonators fall into like two groups. There are resonators that give you buffs or debuffs, and then there are damage resonators. And damage resonators, actually, there is one missing. I'll go to another trap to talk. Well, actually, no. I want to make sure we can see all of them at once. So, trap that I probably have it on. There we go. So, resonators either buff damage or they offer some beneficial status effect or debuff. Of the resonators that boost damage, they all have a condition. And that condition is important to understand. For the fire resonator, these resonators give you a damage increase to enemies that are currently under the burning effect. Now, if you look at the information on most fire traps, the burning effect, when triggered, lasts for about 4.2 seconds. And while those enemies are on fire, any additional hits from traps will deal bonus damage. This will not count for a trap that sets an enemy on fire if they're not on fire. This only counts while the enemy is already under the burning effect. So if you're using a character like Smolder, this means that the area that she can set on fire via something like Heart of Flame actually becomes much more dangerous for enemies to be in. And as long as they're on fire, all of the traps that manage to fire on them are going to do a lot more damage. That's super important, and it's a good idea if you're going to be playing Smolder specifically, or if you like to play Smolder a lot, that if you have fire resonators, you can just slap them on everything. It's a good idea to use these if you're chaining them with other fire traps, or you're chaining traps with fire traps. But in general, you're not going to want to put this on the fire trap itself, because if you're using just a single fire trap, it's not going to necessarily be reigniting enemies that it sets on fire the first time. That's it. Let's move on from it to the ice resonator. This resonator has an outsized damage bonus, and that's specific and for a very good reason. The way that ice works, which I haven't explained in a video yet, is that ice adds stacks of this debuff called Chilled, which slows enemies down slightly and eventually just freezes them. Now, the ice resonator only works on frozen enemies. That's enemies that are frozen after they've gotten all the I can't even, still stuck on the same train of thought. After they have gotten all of the chilled stacks, they freeze. If they are hit with an ability that just forces them to freeze, they then become frozen as well. Only while they are in this frozen status does this resonator work. Now, the funny thing here is that because of the way that the ice resonator works, depending on which traps you're using, you can actually throw this in there. Something like the ice spikes, this is really not going to be a great trap or a great resonator for, mainly because the ice spikes trigger as soon as an enemy steps on it, and since freezing an enemy traps them in place, they're not going to move on to a new spike. So the only way that this would be able to benefit something like the Ice Spike is if you're using a hero to freeze the enemies while the spike is cooling down, and then it gets to refire after they're frozen. However, because of that, if you place this on any other trap that is used in tandem with traps that freeze or the ice vent, because the ice vent is a special case, it has charges and will just blast anything that's on top of it until they're frozen. This will get you a lot of extra damage. For instance, if I were to use ice vents to freeze groups of enemies and then place this resonator onto a swinging mace that was above the ice vent, then the swinging mace, if it hits a frozen batch of enemies, would be doing almost double damage. And that's significant, especially since you can combine the damage buff from this resonator with one of the other resonators that I'll talk about in a moment. So the ice resonator is very powerful, but you just have to be aware that it's not a good idea to use it unless you are setting up traps that combo together and will hit frozen enemies. You don't just want to put these on your ice traps. These really are meant to be paired with traps that are going to hit enemies after they've been frozen. This will be like most ceiling traps, because only one ceiling trap deals ice damage, and that's the icicle trap that you have to manually shoot. That will automatically freeze enemies, so it is actually really good, just because of how many times it hits enemies with chill stacks. But your wall traps and your ballistas are probably going to be the most important for this particular item. And I mentioned well, actually, let's just talk about this one before I go back to the other, the status ones, because the controlled resonator is probably hands down the resonator that most people are going to wind up using. And that's because it's the most consistent. This increases trap damage to stunned or rooted enemies. And it was unclear at first if this also did bonus damage to enemies that might be slowed, and I believe that was proven. And I think Pasankat actually did a test to see whether or not this worked with the Knoll Hunters and Boom Barrels, because Boom Barrels can stack 2 resonators. It's ridiculous. But this resonator will basically give you damage from any source that does crowd control that's not physics, because physics doesn't need bonus damage. It's already ridiculous, even though you can change stuff with physics and get really ridiculous numbers if you need to. But because of the ubiquity of the controlled resonator, you being able to deal extra damage to enemies that are slowed, stunned, or rooted, and the fact that you have an eternal stun or slow in the form of the tar and viscous tar trap, it's really hard not to use this and do well with it. Because of that, this was a resonator that I actually sought after myself very early in the game, and once you get it, it's like really no reason to take it out unless you have like some very specific setups that you want to test out, like those with ice. But those are just, all of those 3 resonators that I just mentioned are all just flat damage increases. Like, while they do boost damage, and the ice resonator is particularly tricky to use because of the requirements to freeze enemies and how not consistent that is unless you're using an ice hero or even a pair of ice heroes. That's why it sort of needed the triple damage bonus that the other resonators have. But then we move on to the status ones. The status ones I think are easier to use and actually just as significant in the right hands, if not more so. My favorite is actually the Debilitation resonator. And the Debilitation resonator I feel is important because the majority of characters that have the ability to deal physical damage do not have the ability to reduce armor consistently. And of those that can reduce armor, it is usually on a timed ability that is either extremely localized in a small area or that they can't activate often. So the Debilitation Resonator will basically allow you to reduce the armor for physical damage only of anything hit for 2 seconds, which will basically give you about a 33% damage increase. I believe that's about the amount for 50% armor. So that's significant. With that happening, it stacks on top of any other armor reductions that you can get. And almost every stunner root that a physical character has does reduce some armor. Ivy's Reach of Roots reduces physical armor. Dobbin's Dust Devils reduces physical armor. So anytime enemies are caught in those slows and snares, their armor is going to go down. This increases that and will basically allow you to do some really extreme damage during the moments when this debuff is active, and will help you deal a lot of damage. So if you're using a character that does physical damage and you have a Debilitation Resonator, throw that in whatever you use the most often. Just put it in there, it will benefit you greatly. Then we have the Kinetic Resonator. This is probably my least favorite resonator in the entire game. That's primarily because, as rare as all of these resonators are, this is probably the most meager bonus that you could possibly get. This is basically like the throwaway resonator, in my opinion, because a 10% slow is not significant. It's good enough to trigger things like the controlled resonator, but it's not really going to do much if you actually want some form of crowd control. That said, if you don't have anything else, feel free to throw it on, because an extra 10% of your time to damage an enemy is still more time. It's something that will always give you a benefit and doesn't really have any condition other than the trap itself hitting an enemy. And ideally, if you place your trap somewhere, they're going to hit something. Now, the Unchained Resonator is probably the biggest secret for new players. And I say that because a lot of players, when they first start the game, they're not really worried about combos at all. They're not even doing basic combos. And because of that, their Unchained meter doesn't fill up too often unless they're picking up power-ups. If you've got your basic combo game down, then this isn't going to matter too much to you. But if you're looking to Unchained more often, especially with the multi-Unchained penalty, every time you Unchained, it takes longer for you to build up the bar to Unchain again. This resonator specifically is going to help you out a lot. What this does is every time a trap causes the death of a minion and this resonator is in it, you gain a bit of Unchained. This is primarily going to be best used with burst damage traps or traps that deal high amounts of damage to individual targets so that they actually score the killing blow. But at the same time, you want to make sure that it's a trap that you can place in a good amount of space. And that will basically make it so that you'll be unchaining a lot more often. Floor Scorcher should be a good choice for this, as long as the Unchained triggers properly on burning enemies. The things like the Swinging Mace are excellent. Ballista are good. You can pretty much put this on anything that deals damage. And the more consistent that damage dealt is, the more Unchained you'll get, and then you can just Unchained all the time. So this is a deceptively good resonator compared to the other ones, but it still relies on hero damage, and you can't really automate this. This is a resonator that requires you specifically to be somewhat active in its use. And the other ones give sort of passive boosts to the trap itself. So this boosts you, the other resonators boost the trap. You can think of it that way, but this offers no benefit to the trap, just to the player. And it's also important to mention that Unchained resonators probably work less well when you're in multiplayer games, primarily due to you having to share both the coin and the trap capacity with 1 to 2 other players. So it has its drawbacks. I mean, it's not hands down the best resonator, but if you're playing alone or you're playing with friends and Unchained seems to be something that's hard for you to unchain often, then give this a shot. So that's pretty much all the resonators. I don't think I should talk about triggers now, because triggers actually got revamped recently and there's a lot of them. But there are springs, and springs and coils are essentially pretty diverse at the moment. Not super diverse, because springs and coils are different. They should really be the same group of items, but springs fall into three categories. There is just the generic boost, which is the charging spring. There's no reason not to put this on every trap that you have that can afford a spring slot. If you have nothing else, this is a de facto boost. Like this just makes it better. I actually don't know why the charging spring is in the game. Just because it seems like everything else sort of has some sort of strategy or play around it, whereas the charging spring is just, this is better, which I would think would be something that would be handled with just the tier upgrades. But in this case, the charging spring actually is still just an okay spring. If you're using it on most traps, the traps still have to fire and they have the cooldown rates. It doesn't make anything particularly broken. It's just like, it tweaks the numbers up a little bit. The double spring is probably the most interesting one, because it will increase the fire rate of a trap by 35%. I believe this is supposed to be flat and additive with the refire bonuses that physics traps get. So it's not going to make them like stupidly fast. You're not going to get like 1 second flip traps. Not with this anyway. With some of the triggers, it may be possible. But either way, double springs really are, for me, intended more for use in endless maps, because while you're going to collect a ton of coin, or if you're playing Dobbin, because Dobbin just generates money like it's going out of style. If you are going to do something like that, I recommend piling up or using as many double springs as possible to get some really powerful trap combos going, and then to make sure that those are as efficient as possible. The short spring is a part that I use maybe way too often. And I started using this initially in the ceiling ballista, because it is a very expensive trap at 1,800 coin a piece, and not affecting an area. It's really hard to justify using just a single one. So because I like placing lots of them, and I am generally really fond of coin efficient traps like the floor spikes, the short springs just made sense to me. The traps fire 15% slower, which isn't a huge amount, but they cost 30% less. So you can imagine yourself with 15% less trap capacity overall, but with effectively about 40% more income, because with all the traps costing 30% less, it's not exactly 30% more coin. It's the effective amount is a bit higher. Actually, I think I can run the numbers real quick. And I was pretty close. It should be about 42% more coin if all of your traps are affected by a similar discount. And while that is pretty straightforward, not everything uses springs. Some of the traps will use coils, and coils are basically different. Coils give you a 10% cooldown and a 25% cost decrease for the discount coil. The braided coil is just 20%, and then there's another coil, I think. No, there is not. There's the self-improving. And that is it. However, the self-improving coil is actually my favorite, because the way that this works is the sooner you have the trap out, the better this becomes, and it maxes out at 30%. So this is one of the few parts that I feel like synergizes with a playstyle or a strategy, just because the whole point of this is to spend the coin on the traps sooner. Like, don't wait until you have a ton of coin and then just spam these, because then the part becomes less effective. But the sooner you can get them out, the more effective they become. And I like that aspect of this particular part. Though I understand that, like, you know, just having a lot of parts that become better as time goes on would probably be really OP. And that's why there's a cap. But yeah, it would probably make Endless way easier than it needs to be. But I think, yeah, I'm going to end this there. There's still a couple other part types to talk about. Let's split this into, I think, one more video. The next one we can cover some of the accumulators, the components, the shielding or cladding, and there's still frames. There's only 2 of those though, and triggers. Triggers we'll probably spend the most time on. So yeah, we'll talk a bit more about that. And then after this, I think I'm going to start talking more about how I like to outfit the individual traps again as part of the preferred parts series. But yeah, if you guys sat through this, you are a trooper. Thank you for tuning in. I sincerely appreciate it. I definitely hope you learned something from this. And until next time, as always, have a good one, folks.